So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this presentation on the Corran Ferry Infrastructure Improvement Scheme. This presentation is supporting the first round of pre-application consultation, and it's to engage the community and other stakeholders and receive feedback on the proposal. Next slide, please. In this presentation, we'll overview the project need, that is the case for change. We'll introduce plans for new ferries and project considerations. We'll touch on project considerations, describe the infrastructure requirements, the designs and the optioneering outcomes to date, as well as outline the next steps and the way forward. I'd like to highlight that this presentation, including copy of the slides and a link to a feedback questionnaire, will be available on the project's consultation website, which is a link provided. And so now I'd like to introduce members of the project team that are here to present tonight. So I'm Claire Williams. I'm an environmental consultant for AFRIC, and I will be supporting the environmental assessment, consultation and consenting process for the project. Can I ask Andrew to introduce yourself?
Good evening, everybody. Yes, I'm Andrew McKeever. I'm a principal engineer with Highland Council, project manager for the professional services contract for the new infrastructure design works, which has been delivered by Wollaston Consultant Engineers, AFRIC Environmental Consultants, and Matheson Mackenzie Ross Architects.
And Murray?
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Murray Bain. I work for the Highland Council as a Corran Ferry project manager, which relates to the replacement of the vessels and the supporting infrastructure.
Harry?
Sorry, yes, hello. I wasn't sure whether you said Barry or Gary, sorry. So I'm Barry Purcell. I'm a civil engineer specialising in maritime infrastructure, working for Wollaston, who are responsible for designing the infrastructure elements of the Corran Ferry scheme. And we're working very closely with AFRIC, the environmental consultants, and MMR, the architects, who you'll also be hearing from tonight as part of that project. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. And Neil?
Hello, I'm Neil Ross, architect at Matheson Mackenzie Ross, and I'm helping the project team with the delivery of the buildings.
Great, thank you. So that's our presenting project team for this evening. If we can go to the next slide, please. So a bit of context, the Corran Ferry service operates across the Corran Narrows of Loch Linnhe, about 8 miles southwest of Fort William. So the ferry makes a short crossing from Ardgour on the west to Nether Lochaber terminal on the east bank, and the service is operated by the Highland Council and provides the transport connection linking communities of the wider region. I'd like to hand over to Murray now to introduce the why behind the project.
Hi everyone, so I'll just start off with the case for change, or the rationale for investment as they refer to it in an outline business case. So the existing vessels are now at the stage with an urgent need of replacement, and that's due to their age and reliability issues and associated difficulty in sourcing parts, or some of the parts becoming obsolete. The older vessel, the Mary Glen Cool's she's now 47 years old and just simply no longer fit for purpose, and recently has just come back from its longest ever refit. It's been away for refit since March. The Corran MB Corran, 22 years old, is quite unique compared to other vessels in that it works at incredibly high intensity, 7 days a week, carrying out 30,000 crossings each year. So breakdowns are now at a higher risk than ever before. The Highland Council's got the oldest fleet of all the local authorities, with an average age of 34.5 years old. Working life expectancy of ferries in Scotland is around 25 years old, with 30 years an absolute maximum. The best case scenario for delivery of the replacement vessels, and this is subject to budget being approved, is 3 to 4 years away. So therefore, the ordering and the commissioning of the replacement vessels needs to commence in the immediate term. Otherwise, service failure will become a reality. The demand for the Corran Ferry services is very high, and it's actually increasing. The ferry is getting busier, and the vessels are obviously too small. It's 270,000 cars a year, 11,000 commercial lorries and buses a year. And anybody who's local will tell you, effectively, the ferry just acts like a bridge, a strategic link, lifeline service. Over the past 10 years, there has been a growth rate of 2.1% in car carryings. And the Corran, she's too small, so she has to shuttle most of the year to try and cope with the demand, as opposed to running to a sort of compliant timetable the vessel has to shuttle. But even with this shuttling, the vessel frequently cannot keep pace with the demand, and at peak periods you get an average of 33% of cars left behind from the ferry, the crossing that they intended to catch. The Maid of Glencoe is only half the space of the Corran with 14 cars and is just way too small, and it's also got limited access to carry commercial vehicles, and recently we've been turning commercial vehicles away in the Maid of Glencoe. So this puts existing pressure on the marshalling capacity, which is just simply too small as well. On the Lochaber side, we've got a space for about 14 cars. On the Ardgour side, space for 45 cars, and even with that, it's not enough to hold the vehicles which have been carried in one crossing by the Corran, even when it's shuttling. So this causes an overspill safety issue at the Lochaber side, with traffic backing up onto the main trunk road onto the 82 at peak periods, and also in addition onto the 861 on the Ardgour side, right round the blind corner. And one other thing that sometimes gets overlooked, which is that's absolutely key as well, is that the vessels overnight on a swing mooring. So what that means is that the vessels are tied up each night on a swing mooring, floating out in the water there, as opposed to a dedicated shoreside infrastructure. So the crew has to start and end each shift via a small flip boat, which is a high risk operation, particularly at night and in bad weather, well managed by the crew, but nonetheless a very challenging operation that happens on a daily basis. Road-based diversion can take up to 2 hours. That's our alternative road to Fort William's a 34-mile detour with 21 miles of it on a single track. And if you wanted to get round to the point where you cross the Corran, that's a 42-mile detour if you're heading south to Oban. And the route has also got a 12-foot height restriction for commercial vehicles, meaning that the peninsula is effectively cut off from large commercial vehicles if the ferry is out of service. And on top of all that, we've got these sort of tricky tidal conditions. The tide rises and falls quite a considerable height. And also on the Lochaber side, on certain tides, they can reach up to 5 or 6 knots, so quite a powerful current coming down through the narrows there. So the fixed link feasibility study, an outline feasibility study for a fixed link across the narrows was submitted to Transport Scotland for consideration in their STPR2, that's a Strategic Transport Projects Review in 2. Unfortunately, it wasn't considered as a project to take forward into the STPR2. So that's projects from 2022 to 2042. That's the Scottish Government's vision for big projects. The two pieces of work, the vessel replacement and infrastructure and the fixed link, they shouldn't be seen to be in competition with each other. And that's because the timescales for delivery for a potential fixed link is 20 years away. So therefore, the ongoing replacement of the vessels, the infrastructure is essential now to prevent service failure until a longer term fixed link can potentially be delivered. So it's not something the council's forgotten about. We've got a dedicated officer in place who will continue to engage with Transport Scotland regarding the council's aspiration for a fixed link. Next slide, please, Claire. So the good news is that things have been really well, and the council have been working very closely with CMAL on their as part of their small vessels replacement programme, and custom ferry design consultants Navalue, who are leading the design for 7 replacement ro-ro electric vessels, which will be for CMAL, Calmac, and 2 Corran vessels for the Highland Council. And this has already, and it will continue to provide the opportunity to the council to benefit from economies of scale and thus lower the costs in vessel design and construction. So electric powered vessels is what's being proposed here, and this is presented an opportunity for the Highland Council to decarbonise their transport network with the introduction of this type of technology, and that'll be in line with the declaration of a climate and ecological emergency by the Highland Council, which is also in line with the Scottish Government 2045 net zero goal, zero emissions. So the first ferry, all going well, is expected to be brought into service in 2025-26 with another ferry a year later. So what we need to do is move away from one vessel shuttling, working hard all day, and move to a two-vessel service running to a compliant timetable, which is part of a transport planning objective. So the idea is that the two vessels would run for 9-10 months of the year, will operate. Refits will be undertaken in the quieter months in December, January, but always leaving one vessel on the route. As mentioned previously, this is assuming that funding is confirmed, and the estimated capital cost currently is about 61.5 million. And if you factor in projected inflation, it could go up to something like 69 million. So the outline business case is now completed. It's going to be presented to members this week. And that is a very, very detailed document. There's a lot of 3 years work gone into that. They'll clearly, in great detail, go through the strategic, economic, commercial, financial management cases and the rationale for investment. So we're hoping that there'll be minimum disruption to the service, but that'll depend on what options that's taken on the infrastructure. But we're looking to have a sort of phased in transition that will bring in the new vessels and phase out the old vessels. So that this design as well for the Corran, so currently we've got these quarter loader vessels and they cannot be used anywhere else, for example, on the CMAL CalMac network. And that's because they've got this quarter loader arrangement as opposed to a row straight through operation that you'll be familiar with the CalMac vessels. So we're moving to that type of design, RoRo, so that'll give us the opportunity for interchangeability within the CMAL fleet. It's worth noting, and we need to be mindful that the Corran Ferry must function as a dedicated standalone two-vessel service with built-in resilience. So the reality is that the vessels will always need to remain at Corran, but nonetheless we'll have that interchangeability. Next slide, please, Claire. And finally, here's a sort of overview of the design that we've narrowed down. So as I said, it's two 32 cars, and here's the deck layout. And one of the particular things that was an absolute red line for the Corran Ferry service is the vessels must be able to accommodate 2 articulated lorries and 18 cars. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Murray. So the project has considered the following elements for both construction and operations. So as Murray highlighted, continuity of the ferry service, also operability, minimising disruption to community and the main traffic routes, minimising noise, especially to residents, disturbance to habitats and protected species, as well as historical and cultural features, carbon accounting, and the use of that low carbon technology, future-proofing the new assets, visual amenity, and construction and maintenance costs. So while that's just a brief overview, we're keen to hear what particular aspects yourselves as stakeholders are most interested in. So I will pass over to Andrew to overview the proposed infrastructure.
Thanks, Claire. So in terms of the existing infrastructure and what's required, there are existing toilets for use by the public at the Ardgour Inn, and there's an existing toilet block on the Nether Lochaber side. All the new infrastructure options consider the provision of new toilet facilities or renovation of the existing toilets. As you will know, the existing marshalling space is regularly at capacity, especially during busy periods, and can cause road safety issues when backing up onto the A82 trunk road and the A861 local road, causing queues and delays on these strategic routes. In order to address the capacity and traffic safety issues, the traffic data has been modelled for future traffic growth, and improved marshalling and parking will be provided. In terms of the slipways, the new larger vessels will require improvements to the operational berths, and new slipways or link span structures and alignment structures will be constructed to accommodate the new vessels and their electric charging requirements. An overnight berth structure will also be required to replace the current unsafe overnight swing mooring arrangement, as Murray highlighted earlier. Next slide, please. So in terms of the there's currently no shelter provision for the ferry marshalling staff, and new purser welfare kiosks will be provided at both terminals as part of the new proposals. In terms of the office facilities, the current arrangement for ferry operations staff is the provision of the ferry office building within Ardgour village. When the two new vessels come into service, an increased number of operations staff will be required to operate the two new vessels. An increased space and crew accommodation will require to be provided, and various options for improvements to existing buildings and new buildings with each of the options is being considered. The Corran Ferry operations currently have the use of the existing storage building adjacent to the Corran Point Lighthouse, and this building will be refurbished to provide improved storage, with the potential to include new public toilets within the building. The options proposed include the possibility that the existing car park at the Nether Lochaber slipway and the existing Ardgour pier will be surplus to requirements, and the Corran Ferry infrastructure improvement team would welcome the community's views on what they would like to see done with each of these items of existing infrastructure. I'll now pass on to Barry Purcell, who will run through the proposed new infrastructure options.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Yeah, so we're going to start off by just having a run through of the options that we're looking at for the Ardgour side of the crossing. I'm aiming to just give you an overview of the current layouts that are on the table and under consideration. In terms of the maritime structures, on the Ardgour side, we're looking to provide an overnight structure. So it's been touched on by previous speakers already, but the key points for the overnight structure is that it needs to avoid the current flip boat transfer that's required every day, twice a day for the existing service. We need to allow overnight charging of the new electric vessels, which would need to be done really from a fixed berth, and we need to provide a sheltered berth essentially to allow both of these operations to happen safely. So it's important that the whatever the final layout of the overnight structure is, provides the shelter from the critical directions. So just to run you through roughly the nice colour scheme that I've got there. So the blue structures that you can see there are would basically be a solid pier structure of some description, or if it's not a solid structure like a sheet piled wall, for example, then it would be an open piled structure, but it would need screens on it to break up wind and wave forces that are acting on the vessel. The pink portion of the overnight structure that you can see that's between the solid part and the shore would essentially be some form of open piled structure or an open structure of some description, so that we are not impacting more than we can avoid any longshore or sediment transport and currents that are currently moving through those areas. We don't want to disrupt them more than we need to. The yellow areas and the green areas, the yellow areas are essentially the areas that we think we would need to lower the level of the seabed to give us enough underkeel clearance for the vessel, and the green areas are basically the side slopes for those reduced level areas. at the moment our thinking is that the route of the overnight structure would either, as you can see in option A there, it would probably leave the shore, or the route of the structure would be between where the existing Ardgour pier is and the existing slipway, which you can't quite see on that picture at the moment. And the other option would be to have it leaving the shore, as you can see in option B, basically opposite where the Corran Ferry office is. So that operationally, that becomes a sensible approach for the people that are actually working on the ferry. I think it's worth noting as well that the route of the pier, we're probably going to be having to do a modest amount of reclamation locally, because we'll need to put in at least a new substation and some feeder pillars in order to service the overnight charging of the vessel on the berths, and there may be a limited amount of additional car parking required for the staff who are working on the pier as well. So that's option A and B. We've also got option C and D on the following slide as well. Claire, please. Okay, so these are just slight evolutions of what you've already seen. The color scheme is the same. Obviously, we've got the route of the pier is either opposite the ferry terminal or next to the Ardgour pier. I think at the moment we are swaying much more towards the option D as our preferred option. The reasons for this are primarily because if we put the location of the proposed slipway, the new slipway, actually means that we can double up the approach structure for the overnight berth and the alignment structure for the slipway berth into a single structure, which will give us an economy of scale. Whereas if we have the overnight structure further to the west, we don't get that opportunity to save that cost by doubling up or giving a dual purpose for the pier, basically. So at the moment, like I say, option D is our preferred option, but once we've done wave current modeling and started to look at the detailed design part of it, then that layout will evolve, I would say. Okay, thank you very much. So here is the sort of combined concept model that we've got here. So you can see that the yellow area on this picture is the proposed marshalling area. The light blue color is the proposed new slipway. You can see that the old slipway sits sort of between the marshalling area and the new slipway. And then, of course, you've got the dark blue colors now representing just purely the overnight structure. Just a few things to note with it. The slipway, we're a bit limited where a new slipway could go. We were concerned that by the further we go to the northwest, we start to get into an area of shallow water. There's also a fish farm, and also we'd be looking at putting all this new infrastructure would be basically sitting in front of people's houses, which we don't think is probably in anybody's interest to have that. Whereas if we go further to the south of the existing slipway, the bathymetry is such that it basically just drops away and it goes down to about -30 meters really quite quickly in the channel there, and the conditions there for waves and for wind and for currents are much more onerous. So we think that really the only realistic place to consider putting a new slipway is between the Ardgour pier as currently sits and the new and the existing slipway. In terms of the marshalling, we did look at review the figures that were given to us at the outset of the project, which included a lot of data that was gathered on a very busy bank holiday weekend in August 2021. Based on this and the growth rates that have been noted for the crossing, which is 2.1% per year, we're recommending that the marshalling areas on both sides of the crossings should have a capacity for 80 cars. I think currently at the moment they have about the capacity of the vessel is what they can take in the marshalling areas, and that's blatantly not enough on certainly on the peak periods. So we're saying that they should have a marshalling area of about 80 cars, which is about 250% of the capacity of the proposed vessel. This will give the users the operation resilience for peak periods, and it will avoid or minimize the possibility of impact on the A861 and the A82 operations, which we know are impacted at peak periods. We're also looking to improve the access for vehicles from both directions. So at the moment, the turn from the northwest as you approach the Ardgour slipway marshalling area is basically not suitable for purpose. So we would want to make sure that there was a suitable access for vehicles coming from either direction. The only way of really realizing this would be to undertake limited reclamation. So we would envisage it would probably be rock fill with a rock armored slope on its outer edges. I think the thing that you can obviously see there is that the critical element of the Ardgour development will be making very, very careful consideration to the infrastructure phasing and how those works can be realized whilst avoiding wherever possible and certainly minimizing any disruption to the existing Ardgour to Nether Lochaber service. And that's obviously a challenge that we need to think about in the design development stage, but it's certainly something that will be very critical for whoever is the contractor for this to manage on site. Okay, that's it for me. I'll just hand you on to Neil Ross, who will talk you through the building side of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. Yes, I'm Neil Ross. I'm an architect assisting the project team with the building side of the project. As Andrew said, the brief was to provide improved accommodation for the ferry offices, the ferry stores, public and staff toilet facilities, and residential accommodation for around 8 staff. A few options were looked at, and I'll give you a brief run through of the different aspects and where we've got to at the moment. So option A was a reworking of the existing ferry house site, which is the top yellow box on the screen there. The existing ferry house offices were, as you may know, originally quite a small house. In this scenario, the house would be demolished, replaced with a 2-storey building with the offices, storage and living accommodation all on one site. Pros and positives of this was that the building would be close to the overnight berth and ferry operation with good sight lines to the ferry and marshalling areas. But there would be some disruption during construction, of course, when the ferry office staff would have to move out to a temporary building. We'd end up with quite a large building on a small site, which also slopes up to the rear, which is limited space for parking. Some parking would need to be across the main road on possibly reclaimed land. And the scale of this new building could possibly be at odds with the other largely single-storey small buildings that are along the street front there, Ardgour. The next option we looked at was option B, which was to relocate to the marshalling area by the lighthouse. We'd have a new building there for crew accommodation, offices, stores, and toilets quite near the lighthouse. This would result in no interruption to the existing ferry house operation. They could still run their office from the existing building. Another pro was that the ferry house could, after completion, be repurposed for affordable housing or sold on, possibly. But space at the marshalling area is limited by existing infrastructure such as the main road and the village septic tanks. Sight lines to the ferry were not as good as they are at the moment, and some land reclamation would be required. Option C is a mix of A and B. It would involve refurbishing the ferry house office and a new build near the lighthouse marshalling area. The ferry house would be refurbished and extended for offices, meeting rooms and staff welfare. No accommodation there anymore. New crew accommodation and public toilets would be near the marshalling area down near the lighthouse. The good side to that is the office would be close to the overnight structure, good sight lines to the ferry, but again, disruptions during construction, like in option B. Space in marshalling area is quite limited, as before, and yeah, land reclamation required. Option D involves refurbishing the existing office and extending it, and a new build for staff accommodation on land at the south end of Corran Gardens. The existing ferry house is refurbished and extended for new office, meeting room and welfare, and the lighthouse store would become public toilets and ferry stores. The ferry house stays close to the operations. Staff accommodation could be in a block of one block, residential block, or more likely 2 or 3 houses for ferry staff and their families. Ardgour is considered by planning to be a growing settlement, and land at the end of Corran Gardens was zoned for housing expansion. Construction of access here could serve also new affordable housing if required. But disruption to the ferry house would also occur during construction. The way around this would just be a temporary porta cabin would be used by the staff while the project is underway, and some additional land purchase would be required at the end of Corran Gardens. Thank you. I'll hand back to Barry Purcell now.
Thank you very much, Neil. Okay, so now to look at the kind of conceptual layouts for the Nether Lochaber side of the crossing. Obviously, this is slightly more problematic, or just as problematic a side to develop, because there's very limited existing space to develop on. So the first couple of options that we're looking at here, A and B, are just looking at what we may be able to fit in and around the existing, if you like, undeveloped areas at Nether Lochaber. So option A is basically a new slipway sitting immediately to the south of the existing slipway, and looking at putting the marshalling area would basically be in the area immediately to the north of the existing slipway, but probably the full makeup of that wouldn't be able to be realized until we'd actually transferred the vehicles, the service over from the existing slipway to the new slipway. You can see that on this side, we've got a slipway, we've got an alignment structure. We don't have an overnight structure, because the overnight structure, all the overnight accommodation for the vessel is all going to be sitting on the Ardgour side, which is a much more sheltered side of the crossing overall, especially for the southwest, which is the most critical direction for the UK generally, but certainly creates the larger waves and the worst conditions on the Nether Lochaber side of the crossing. So you can see that there's basically a turning circle at the top of the roundabout, and then they come and the vehicles would be facing sort of southwest, waiting for their instruction to move onto the link span and get onto the vessel. In this scenario, it's worth pointing out as well that the existing toilet would probably just be refurbished. It wouldn't be replaced or anything like that. We'd just be able to refurbish it, and we'd probably have to provide some additional parking, because the slipway is basically sitting with its route at the location where the existing car park is on the Nether Lochaber side. What this doesn't do, it doesn't really, it certainly moves all the traffic quite a long way away then from the A82 junction. There's no, we're not looking at the moment at making any changes to the A82 junction for the Nether Lochaber turnoff, but recognise that maybe the issues with it are not purely down to just the fact that the marshalling can begin to back up during busy periods onto the A82, but that's not something that we've been looking at just at the moment. So I think if we move on to option B, you can see that this is just a slightly different reimagining of the same area. So in this one, we've got the slipway sitting to the north of that grassy area. We've got marshalling, they come down the same road and they turn, and in this case the vehicles will be pointing northeast, waiting for the order to go onto the vessel. We'd be able to retain the existing car parking area. It'd probably be maybe slightly easier to phase the construction to do this, but it's still going to be a difficult operation and require a bit of careful planning and traffic management to do. I think the thing that's worth pointing out about both of these solutions is that they are sitting directly in front of at least 3 or 4 residential properties, which don't have anything sitting in front of them at the moment, and they would be those properties would be taking the brunt of the disruption, and they would be losing a bit of quite a lot of visual immunity, I guess, compared to what they're currently enjoying on the shore there. So with that in mind, we've started looking at a few different other options. So the next one that we looked at is option C. So in option C, we imagined that you might be able to gain access to the site from the south, basically near the Bunree junction, and come across what's basically a low value habitat at the moment. It's fields and also has quite a lot of rhododendron growing through it, which is a non-native species. It certainly goes a long way to solving a lot of the space issues in terms of the other thing that we've not mentioned there is that the contractor, when he's doing the works, is going to need office space, he's going to need storage space for his equipment, he's going to need car parking. So there's a lot of potential disruption there which would need to be located somewhere. So I think if option C was seen as one way that you could probably alleviate a lot of those issues. In this case, you've got a fairly long leading road, and you'd have to make a cutting through the coastal bluff, avoiding any of the archaeological features that there are in that area. We'd be able to put the marshalling really quite linear along the foreshore there, and then the slipway would be sitting just to the north of the existing slipway, and then so really the only bit you're managing in terms of the difference between the existing service and the new slipway is just one small kind of crossing in order to access it, and that's something that would probably be a bit easier to manage from during the construction period. I think that it's worth pointing out with this one is that essentially that removes all the traffic from the Nether Lochaber turnoff that's specifically related to the ferry service. So that may be seen as a significant benefit to the local community there, and it doesn't have quite the same land take in terms of disruption to the grassy area that sits to the north of the existing link span, the slipway rather. Okay, option D, right. So these are options D and E are essentially cut from the same cloth as well. As I said before, that when you go to the south of where the existing slipways are, the wave climate, the wind climate, the current climate are all significantly more onerous. And so really putting a slipway significantly further to the south of where they currently sit is really not seen as a realistic option at all. So what we imagined is that maybe the best approach was to consider putting the new infrastructure in what's essentially a greenfield site immediately to the north of the Nether Lochaber community as it stands at the moment. So if you look at the option D there, you can just see in the bottom of the screen the current turn off for the from the 82 for the Nether Lochaber slipway, and the end of where the existing residential properties are. There's an area of wooded foreshore there, which is undeveloped and would potentially give slightly improved current conditions, certainly, and possibly less exposed to the wave action that sort of plagues the east coast of the loch just at that location. We'd be able to look at improving the vehicle access from the A82, and as I said before, this is another option for removing all the ferry traffic from the immediate Nether Lochaber community that's currently living cheek by jowl with the ferry service, and it also gives us an opportunity to control some of the invasive species that we know are in that area, such as rhododendron and Japanese knotweed. Obviously, the new junction is going to require careful consideration. There's a couple of wee archaeological features. I think there's a ruins just in one location down in the woodland there, and there's the potential for some protected species in the area, which may require some form of mitigation. And obviously, during the construction, there's probably an increased likelihood that there would be some form of traffic management required on the 82 while the works were underway. But it does give us a good opportunity to improve the junction for users coming from the north or from the south along the 82, and avoid the sort of problems that they are currently having on the 82 on this side. So on this one, you can see that the slipways to the north side of that area and the marshalling area is sitting immediately to the south. And option E, which is on the next slide, is basically exactly the same area, but in this case, the slipway sits on the south side of the area, and the marshalling area sits to the north. Obviously, for options D and E, we definitely need to provide a new toilet block. We'd probably need to put some car parking in as well, and we'd need to make sure that the footpath and the National Cycle Network connections were fully maintained and extended out so that people can still access the Corran Ferry in its new location. When we've done the option assessment on it, if you go to the next slide, please. So in our option study, when we've considered all the options that for the Nether Lochaber side, at the moment, option E comes out as the front runner, and that's mostly driven, I think, the difference really between option D and E is primarily that we've got a shorter ferry route, so there's less chance of disruption to the ferry service, and we think as well that the sight lines from taking the junction slightly further to the north off that stretch of road will give us slightly better sight lines for traffic safety as well. But that's something that obviously would need to be looked at in a lot more detail when we get into the next stage of the design development. Okay, thanks very much for your attention. I'll hand you back to Claire Williams.
Brilliant, thank you, Barry. So where to from here? The next steps of the project is to consult for public and stakeholder input, and this will continue throughout the planning phase of the project with a second round of consultation as the project progresses. Finer details of the infrastructure designs will be finalised in consideration of the feedback received, and then the preferred designs and construction methodology will be subject to environmental impact assessment to understand potential effects against various criteria, environmental, such as ecological features, but also social, like traffic and visual amenity that we've mentioned. The project will then look to submit applications for planning consent to the Highland Council Planning Department and marine licensing to Marine Scotland, with further consents and licenses to be sought as required. So subject to these consents, secure funding and council committee approval, the construction phase is expected to be scheduled from Q1 2024 to Q4 in 2025. And next slide, please. So now it's time. We'd like to hear your thoughts and queries on the infrastructure design and the proposal as a whole. So a reminder, this presentation and a link to the feedback survey will be available on the consultation webpage. And please note, so representations made via this forum are not representations to Highland Council Planning Department or Scottish ministers, but rather there'll be opportunity for formal representation once the applications for planning consent and marine licensing have been submitted. So thank you for your time. We'll now stop the